Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing the album Red Queen to Gryphon 3 by the band Gryphon.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So as always, this is Red Queen to Gryphon 3 and I'm going to share with you some of my favorite bits from this album. This is the best album ever. Like, it's 10 out of 10. I love it so much, but I'm jumping myself. I'm not supposed to say the score right now, but I love this album so much. It's like the best album I've heard on this list for sure, and probably one of the best albums I've ever heard in the prog scene. And you know what, don't even get me started on like what's my favorite track off this album. I can only tell you like what's my least favorite track off this album, I guess, and it's gonna be Lament, because it's like a 9.5 out of 10 instead of all the other songs, which are total 10s out of 10s. I have to calm down because this has to be a review, but this album is so good. Okay, so in order to go more in depth about this album, I have to talk about their debut album, which we've listened on episode 2 on this list. So their first album, their debut album, which is simply called Gryphon, we've already listened to it, and I just want to address the fact that I'm really happy that we listened to it before this one, because the album we're listening to today is their third release and that was their first, and I think that if we would have listened to them in the opposite order, it would have been kind of confusing, because this album is amazing, it's really high level of music, it's really good, and the first one was like, you know, it's not so good, it's not too bad, but I didn't really all that much like it. And the fact is, if I were to listen to this amazing album beforehand, I would be so baffled by the fact that the music found on the first album is so not on this level. And for those of you who don't know their debut album, I'm gonna talk about it just a bit. It's an album made mostly out of English folk songs and the reimaginations on that album. And I think there's like 3 original tracks on that one. But that album is sort of medievalish, like Renaissance album. It's not really the kind of music which is done today. I think it's not really accessible to most people because it just sounds like medieval music. And although a lot of the instruments that are found on Red Queen to Gryphon 3 are also found on the debut, it's not something that can be said on the opposite, because this third album of theirs is unlike the first one because it uses technology more and it actually uses some, you know, electrical instruments on it. And I think the fact that they chose to do that and they did it in like just the right amount made this album so perfectly balanced, and it sounds so harmonized with one another. And overall, this album really feels like their first debut album, but a whole lot better. And yes, this album we're listening to today is a perfect example of a band going ahead and analyzing what they've done on their first release and realizing what worked and what didn't, and then improving upon that and creating something which is similar but only consists of the best parts, and trying new things which would go better with their music. So what's so perfect about this album, at least in my opinion? Well, first of all, this is prog folk. This is one of those genres which have a lot of really known albums and really good ones, such as Aqualung and Thick as a Brick by Jethro Tull and several other albums. But in my opinion, I think that this album is also equally acceptable to being a symphonic prog album. Most of the, well-known prog albums out there are symphonic prog, most of what Pink Floyd does and Genesis and otherwise other bands. And I think this album can also be categorized as that, and it would fit pretty perfectly. And Red Queen to Gryphon 3 is really a prog album. There is no dead moment on it, everything is always changing, they don't really last with the same repeating pattern for more than a few seconds at a time, and I love it so much because that's what progressiveness is, at least to me. And when listening to it, from the first moment I actually realized what I was listening for, I got into it all in. I was expecting what would happen at each turn. I wanted to see and hear what was the next, chord and note on every single time that I was listening to it. I was so enthralled by it and I was so anticipating the music that came on here, and honestly I didn't want it to end. Now, this album also features some really good multi-instrumentation. A lot of the people on here play a lot of different instruments, but the thing that makes it most important and most interesting is the fact that they use odd instruments which are not usually heard in a lot of scenes. Instruments like the recorders, the flutes, the bassoons, the timpani, and even the crumhorn. And if you don't know what's a crumhorn, here's a picture of a crumhorn. And yes, of course, the inclusions of keyboards and electric guitars and electric bass is also really good, and using them in such a modest way that it just emphasizes how good the music is and its true potential. Honestly, I feel this album actually radiates more folky influences and sound than the first album, although their first album was pretty acoustic and was actually pretty prominently played with instruments that could be found back in Renaissance times. And honestly, if I had to describe it in some way, I'd say this album really feels like it was a musician / time traveler that went back in time, gave the people instruments that wouldn't be invented in the next few hundred years, and taught them how to play them, and then you got something that feels like medieval people playing electrical, technological instruments that are so unakin to that time, and I think that's exactly what Gryphon did on here. In this album, it doesn't mess around, it doesn't stall one moment in order to get to the next. There is no point which is just a transitional point between two, sections on the song. Every single moment on here is well thought out. It's so short, if you miss it, you don't get the amazingness of each and every moment on here, and I love it so much, and I want to say a big sorry, a big apology to Gryphon for letting you down on the first review that I did on you, because you are truly the unsung heroes of folk prog. I'm so flustered about this album. I don't even know what to say about it. I know that the way I've been speaking about it is probably odd, but it's just so good. It's one of those albums that I highly advise just go ahead and listen to it. When I listened to my first Gryphon album, I was sending my review to a couple of friends because it was still my second episode on the show, and a lot of people told me, oh yeah, that's a great album, I haven't listened to it in a while, but you should totally go check out Red Queen to Gryphon 3 because that's their masterpiece, and I agree with that so heavily. It's such a good album that you should go ahead and listen to. Dan Pearce's artwork strikes again. Much like the first cover of Gryphon, this one also features a detailed drawing of what's represented on this album. And in the case of this album, it is representing a game of chess with its songs and, their titles, and the cover itself also represents a game of chess being held. And the colors on here, they're diverse, but they are also in tandem with one another, and I really like that because it just doesn't go all over the place. It really stays in line with itself, and I think this would make for a lovely thumbnail for this video. Now, looking into the details on this cover, because there's a lot of them, I love seeing little things like the cat that is preying on the bird, the owl in the background that is watching the game intently, the butterfly above, and probably most importantly, the griffin in the background that's in the bushes that's about to be slain by the horse-ridden knight. I don't know if that's supposed to have some meaning to it, but I hope not, because there's no reason why Gryphon would want to kill off their symbol, but who knows. Oh, and if you look closely, you probably can't see it right here on the side, but if you look closely, you can actually see Dan Pierce's signature on the side of the chessboard, and although it kind of takes from the cover itself, I don't think it's that noticeable to actually be a bad implementation. So overall, this is a great cover for a great album. So I said it once and I'm gonna say it again. This album receives an absolute 10 out of 10. I loved it so much. This is a fantabulously magnificent album that you should totally go ahead and listen to. Now, when I last rated an album a 10 out of 10, which was Touch by the band Touch, I wanted to give it a 10 and I was feeling confident about it, but I had my doubts about it. And rating this album, I have no doubts that this album is perfect. So yeah, go listen to it, but I guess that's about it, guys. Stay tuned for tomorrow because we're gonna be listening to an album called Space Hymns by the band/person called Ramses. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.